You're listening to Switched On Australia, the podcast that tracks the opportunities and challenges of electrifying everything, everywhere. Switched On is brought to you by the publishers of Renew Economy, Australia's best informed, most read website focusing on the green energy transition, and is supported by Boundless Earth, using philanthropy, investment and direct advocacy to help Australia become a global force in a decarbonised world. Hello, I'm Anne Delaney. Welcome to the Switched On podcast. Thanks for joining me. I'd like to start today by acknowledging that Switched On is produced on the lands of the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation in northern New South Wales. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people. In the Northern Territory, remote First Nations communities are battling energy insecurity on a daily basis. Power outages, a reliance on dirty diesel, mandatory prepaid electricity meters, regular disconnections when residents run out of money to top up their power cards. These are all part and parcel of accessing energy for remote communities in the Territory. But a small grassroots, Indigenous-led community development and capacity building organisation is now working with First Nations communities to solve some of these energy security problems. From installing solar panels on the community centre in Marlinja to the first Indigenous-owned utility-scale renewable microgrid in Borroloola, Original Power is helping communities make the transition to clean energy. I spoke recently to some of the team from Original Power, Lauren Mellor, Chantelle Johns and Madison Sturgess, very appropriately on International Women's Day. And I first asked Lauren Mellor, the Clean Energy Communities Coordinator for Original Power in the Territory, to give me an overview of their work.
So in more recent years, our work has centred around also supporting communities who see the opportunities to solve long-standing energy security problems for their communities by moving towards lower cost clean energy and to really start to take a leadership role in the clean energy transition and all of the opportunities for jobs, employment, wealth creation and to address energy hardship in our communities. So that sort of has been one of the focuses of our work, and I work in the Northern Territory where energy insecurity, energy poverty has been a really long-standing issue and a huge challenge for communities, and one of the key reasons why communities are held back from achieving a fair playing field in terms of economic and social development, because the basics for having a healthy home or a healthy community just don't exist when you don't have access to functional, reliable and affordable power. So our Clean Energy Communities project has essentially started a whole series of work with communities using demonstration projects like the Marlinja microgrid and other community energy projects to work through the structural barriers that are preventing mob from having access to renewables and affordable power at the moment.
So just before we go into some of those great projects that you're involved with, for people who aren't fully aware of the situation for many First Nations people in the Territory, can you paint a picture of the situation for many communities, what many have to contend with?
Yeah, well, the situation in the Northern Territory that is very different from how most other Australians access energy services is we have a mandated system of prepaid metering in the Northern Territory that is almost exclusively targeted at Indigenous households. So it's been brought in as quite a discriminatory measure, but the effect of it has been to provide administrative ease to retailers to automatically disconnect people who are in financial and energy hardship. So we have over 10,000 households in the Northern Territory that access energy services through this prepaid metering system, where residents are required to go to the shop to top up credit on a power card, $10, $20 each time, come home, swipe that onto the meter, and the meter and the energy services in the home will function for as long as that credit lasts, which isn't very long. So while we have a flat tariff in the Northern Territory, people on prepaid meters actually end up paying quite a bit more for their energy services, because people would be aware that the housing design in the Northern Territory is well below the National Energy Performance standards. So Most of our homes in the Northern Territory and remote communities sit well below the 5-star rating and well below the national standard of 7 for the energy performance requirements of new build homes. It also means residents need to use less energy efficient appliances because they're cheaper and more readily available in remote areas. The lack of insulation, the poorly designed homes historically, overcrowding in the homes, all of those things lead to higher energy consumption in those homes, and people paying really extraordinarily high rates for their power.
Yeah, what sort of money are they paying?
Well, in Marlinger, we completed a community energy survey and asked residents how much they thought they were paying, and the average was about $150 a week.
Wow.
Sometimes more, depending on how many people are using that house at any one time. Often in the homes you can have, it might be a 3-bedroom home and there are 10 people living in that home because of the lack of availability of safe housing in the Northern Territory. So the affordability is a massive issue in the Northern Territory for those energy services out bush, because people are trying to maintain thermal comfort. They're trying to heat and cool homes that aren't designed to be well insulated, and they're not built for those purposes, and they're trying to service a lot of people with really energy inefficient appliances in the home. So it's a struggle, and largely those consumers on prepaid metering arrangements have been left out of the reporting that's required in the national energy market. Until very recently, we had almost no data on the experiences of energy insecurity other than anecdotally from those experiencing it. Until a couple of years ago, we had the Australian National University work with a range of Indigenous research partners and community-controlled organisations in the Territory to look at the actual data on the rate of disconnections for prepaid meter customers. What they found was, on average, every 3 days, Indigenous customers on prepaid meters are being disconnected from power for periods of 10 hours or longer. And we know that in many cases those disconnections can last for a lot longer, until essentially people aren't reconnected until they have the ability to pool together enough funds to reconnect power. So sometimes that necessitates families moving next door to access a hot shower so the kids can go to school, or food in the fridge and medications that are needed for people's health. Those things spoil and can't be used and are thrown out. So the disconnections do create quite a big disruption to household and community life.
But it also disconnects the water in certain circumstances, doesn't it? Because the pumps would go down?
Yeah, in Marlinger, which Chantelle can talk about, the situation there is that the community receives power over a 25-kilometre transmission line from a diesel gas hybrid power station in the township of Elliott, and that feeder line is quite old. It's generally fairly unreliable. We've got a lot of issues with the supply side going down, and when that happens, the community's bore pumping services are also connected to that supply side, and so the community has for long periods of time lost access to drinking water and power at the same time. And when you've got temperatures that are routinely over 42 degrees for weeks at a time, that's a really dangerous situation for anybody's health, and the community's just been through that with a 3-week water and power outage in the community due to voltage fluctuation issues for 3 weeks over Christmas just recently.
Yes. Just before I go to Chantelle, tell me about the situation with the diesel, because with the generators, the generator backups that a lot of the communities have, they'd obviously be very reliant on diesel as well, wouldn't they?
Yeah, we use a lot of diesel in the Northern Territory. It's the primary source of power generation for the remote communities, of which there are at least 72 registered remote communities. The figures on how much diesel is being used are not regularly published in the Northern Territory, but we believe there's about $30 million a year spent burning diesel to supply power to the remote communities. That really needs to be addressed as a matter of priority by getting communities access to renewable energy, so we can start to offset some of those diesel costs. Because you imagine in remote areas, the cost of maintaining and servicing diesel as the primary form of generation, not only the cost of burning the diesel, but the cost of barging in, shipping in on really cut up roads in the wet season, all of this diesel. It's a huge operation, and a lot of these communities could be better served cost-wise and have more more resilience in terms of their essential services if we were to move away from that total reliance on diesel in the remote areas.
So at Mullinger, can you just give me a bit of an overview of what you were trying to achieve at Mullinger before we go to Chantelle?
Yeah, so in Mullinger, like the rest of the Northern Territory communities who are on prepaid meters, we knew that energy hardship was a big challenge. We wanted to lower the cost of energy, the amount that households were forced to spend just to keep the lights and power on. And so back in 2019, Mullinger community invited Original Power to come and sit down, work with the community on some solutions that would start to move away from reliance on diesel power and help the community set up their own community energy systems that were lower cost and more sustainable, better for country and better for the climate. So that was the start of that partnership there, and we sat down and worked through a community energy planning process where we thought about the types of loads that were being used in households and for the community now, the types of challenges we were facing, thought about the regulatory framework, where funding might be available, and we thought about the future of Mullinger and what people were planning towards, what sort of businesses and expansion activities and growth might happen with the population in Mullinger over the next 20 or so years, and thought about how we would plan an energy system that worked for the community. We began with repowering the community centre with solar and batteries so that we had something that would benefit the entire community early on, and it meant residents had some experience of working on and delivering that project as well, but it also meant we had immediately improved the energy resilience of the community there. So when we did have supply side blackouts, there was a community centre there where people could still turn an air conditioner on or access refrigeration and that sort of thing.
Maybe I can bring Chantelle Johns in here, because Chantelle, you're from Mullinger. Can you just paint a picture about the Mullinger community, where it is and how big the community is, and until recently, some of the problems that you've had in accessing power?
Yeah, so Mullinger is located on the off the Stewart Highway. It's around 250 odd k's, like north of Tennant Creek.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the power issues and everything we've had there. I mean, I've been living there with my partner for almost 9 years now. He's originally from there, next in line, traditional owner. I'm not originally from there. But yeah, no, so over the years when I've been there, the power issues have always been the same, really. Pretty much we're guaranteed at least once or twice a week, disconnections and things like that. And it sort of just got to a point where the community as a whole, we were kind of fed up with it.
Yes.
And wanted to know what was out there that we could explore. We were very grateful to come across Original Power and had help from them, obviously with, like how Lauren said, with the community centre first, and then went down all the processes and the steps and stuff to go into the now microgrid project. But yeah, it's great to have the option to do it. But like as you were saying before, with the issues with the power and the water and everything like that, and how Lauren was explaining, we had multiple weeks where we were, carting water in buckets just to be able to, have drinking water or flush the toilet and, all those sort of things. So yeah, it's definitely good that we're looking forward more.
Yeah. Tell me what the community members knew about renewable energy when you first started these projects. Were people very aware of what it could offer?
No, not at all. Nobody really had any idea about it, and I think maybe if we did know about it, we probably would have started things earlier than we did. But yeah, it was just purely through a lot of the community members were taking part, like with the fracking and stuff. Again, so and that's where we all got to hear about all this, like solar and options and things like that. And some of the leaders brought those ideas back to the community, and that's what started it. but yeah, nobody, I mean, we're very cut off, I would say, from the rest of the world. We're all pretty much in our own bubbles, so we didn't really have any idea about solar. I mean, there was a few of us, we obviously knew about it, but didn't think it was really possible for communities. A lot of the communities in the Territory are very much behind in everything. So the idea of having any sort of solar or anything in community was just not really on anybody's thought.
I was just going to say, I understand that the community was very concerned about that risk of fracking near country.
Yes.
What impact? Is that what you reckon rallied the community behind in trying to find a better alternative?
Yeah, I think I believe so. It was definitely the push I think the community needed to sort of say, hey, we don't want that. We want something more clean, more reliable, around here. We don't want to be promoting that sort of thing. Obviously, that comes with its challenges. There were some people that were for it, but majority we were all against it, and we wanted something different. We did not want to do that. Like, it's all about protecting and advocating for country, and because it's so rich with culture and everything there, like, we don't want to ruin it. The water and the land and that is everything, to everyone in community, and we did not want to destroy that. So in fighting against that, that's how we got to learn what else was out there.
Yes, that's interesting. And how has the community benefited? How have your lives actually been impacted? How have they changed for the better?
Yeah, so it has been awesome. Like, we've been able to use the community centre a lot more. A few of us actually had to use it COVID times to quarantine and stuff as well. So it's made it a lot more comfortable. It's also a space that is used through like cultural ceremony and that times. So it's just made everything more accessible to the community. It's a space where, like, if we have meetings and community meetings and things like that, it's a more comfortable environment and that now. And it's just the waiting game really for the houses now with this next project. But it's just made it all around more comfortable and more like looking towards the future and what else we can do in community after this as well. It's sort of just given us something to look forward to, I guess.
Yes. And do you think the community is pretty united in wanting more from original, or more assistance from original power in getting things improved even more? Do you think the community is united on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, a lot of communities in general are very much behind and everything, and we sort of get left behind, and an original power has kind of given us all a voice, and been there like for information and just to answer questions on, we have this idea and how can we do this, and that. So it has been really, really great for the community, like as a whole. And then it's also brought a lot of opportunities, like for community members with training and jobs, even like myself, getting a job, with original power and that. And it's not really something that's very common in very remote communities. So it has been great for us out there in Mullingar,
Chantelle Johns from the Mullingar community in the Northern Territory. Following the success of the community solar project, Original Power has been working with Mullingar to build a small microgrid. With a 100 kilowatt solar array and a 136 kilowatt per hour battery, it'll be connected to the grid but can stand alone, and it'll be connected at the end of April. One innovation of this project is it will minimise the disconnections that are a feature of prepaid power meters. But getting this project up and running hasn't been easy. They've had to pick their battles with bureaucracy and the power utility. Madison Sturgess is the Clean Energy Project Lead for Original Power.
So, as you know, we've had the community centre powered and they've been able to demonstrate that there's a feed-in tariff equivalent. The average Aussie household has been able to have an equivalent experience of for the past 20 years. And once we were able to sort of show the benefit of that, not just to community, but also to the utility, we then looked at, well, how can we have a centralised community solution as well, or a community-led solution? So in 2021, a feasibility study was completed, and from that, 2 solutions were proposed. So you either put rooftop solar on all 18 homes in the community with a centralised community battery, or you centralise the generation and co-locate it with the battery, so essentially a microgrid. And, you know, it totally makes sense to go ahead with the rooftop, right? That's quite cheaper, and you don't have to work with all these microgrid controls and switching and that degree of complexity. So we put that forward, and the utility was really quite interested in going ahead with that because technically, as we mentioned, it's the least complex. And as we were ready to put that to community, we were also informed that the leasing agent, or whoever would hold the lease for the homes in Marlinger, was going to change from the Land Trust to the Department of Housing. And what that meant was the consent that we already had from community to go ahead with this project, we had to start from scratch. We now had to go through the Department of Housing.
Right.
And what we found in that process was that the Department of Housing wasn't ready to take on a new asset class under their management. They didn't have the capacity, they didn't have the funds, they just were not there, they were not ready.
Right.
It was seen as too risky. And again, just for some perspective about that statement, this is based on technology that the average Australian has been benefiting from for 20 years.
I was going to say, I mean, it's just solar on rooftops, isn't it?
That's it. It's not specialist knowledge at this stage in Australia. So that was really quite disappointing, but it did answer the question of which of the 2 solutions to move forward with.
Right. You had no option but to move forward on the microgrid.
Absolutely. It wasn't a technical issue, it wasn't a financial issue, it was a regulatory issue that determined which solution we went forward with.
Right. So how far are you along with the project now?
Yeah, so hopefully, as long as the rain stays away and the wet season draws to an end, we will begin deployment next month, so in April, which is really exciting. We've worked closely with 5B, who's made a really wonderful contribution towards the project in rolling out their Mavericks. So that's a very specific, 5B specific bit of solar PV tech. And we also have Bushgrid, our contractor, working on the BESS, a containerized BESS that sits in the same lot. So that'll roll out next month. And we will also be engaging local talent to be a part of that process. That's very important to us, not just for the jobs and opportunity creation, but we intend that we have a couple of local technicians engaged in the O&M stage, the operation maintenance stage of this project as well.
And tell me, what is this microgrid going to provide the community? Just spell that out for me.
Yeah, sure thing. So just a bit of an idea about the lay of the land with the network itself, because that really does determine what kind of solution you can pursue. There is a diesel generated power plant at Elliott, so about 30 kilometres away from Marlinger, and that's owned by the state or the territory utility. Then a big line runs out from Elliott past Newcastle Waters, which is a large station, and then the last tip of the feeder line is Marlinger. And so there's a lot of instability that happens there. And so by having a low voltage, and that's very important in this, a low voltage microgrid located in the community downstream of this step up, step down transformer, we're able to make sure that the community has a self-sufficient supply and can also work if the grid goes down, then the microgrid can kick in and offer some resilience there as well. And in the case of Marlinger, just at Christmas, not only does the power go down, our power has fluctuation issues, what also happens is that the water pumps and treatment plant also can go down. So before Christmas, they were without reliable water for 3 weeks, which is just, that becomes a massive follow-on of resilience for communities, not just energy resilience or climate resilience, it's also these other follow-on effects.
Yes. I mean, this is going to revolutionise the opportunities for the community, surely.
I mean, we hope so. That's our thesis. But what I didn't mention is what we consider to be the key innovation piece. And so the revenue or the negotiated tariff, for another term that we have agreed upon with the retailer, instead of that being a dollar amount in the pocket of community, it actually ends up becoming a credit on their prepaid meters,
Right.
which effectively reduces the cost of electricity for consumers, for members of the community, which in turn reduces the frequency of disconnections in community. And you can imagine, the social and economic impacts that come from having that affordability, availability, that reliance, that stability in the energy that is coming into homes and into community. And that's the key innovation piece.
That is innovative. Tell me how you came up with that idea, because that seems incredibly clever to me.
Well, I'm only a year into the job, so the innovation and brains came before me. But Lauren and a few other consultants that put their brains together. Our Brains Trust basically met with the manufacturers of secure meters years ago now, and asked what is actually possible. So these meters are,
and also what is the problem that you're trying to solve?
Yeah, exactly. So these meters, as many Australians may not know, is just like a prepaid phone. So once you run out of credit, it stops working. The lights go out, and if you live on the East Coast and you're part of the NEM, you actually have 6 months worth of regulatory protections before your lights get turned off. And that's not the case for prepaid meter customers. And, when you're thinking about the fact that most prepaid meter customers are some of the most vulnerable consumers on the network or isolated networks, that becomes a punitive system, and it's not actually equitable by any definition. So, Original Power went to the manufacturers and said, this seems like it could actually just be a software and not a hardware issue. Is that right? And the answer was yes. And so instead of wanting to pull out those meters and really fight hard against the regulation, it was already a difficult environment to pull these meters out of homes and replace a whole commercial system for the Northern Territory. Lauren and the team really found we can actually just flip this on its head and change the software to be equitable. And this is these prepaid meter creditings are already done for I believe some senior citizens in the Northern Territory. So it's a process that already exists, it's just not being applied in this sense. And so we're making these prepaid meter systems less punitive, more inclusive, and that the equity buy-in that communities can bring results in a tangible and direct cost reduction to consumers.
Yeah. So actually I might bring Lauren back in here. And I mean, Lauren, was there any chance at all of getting rid of those prepaid meters?
Early on in the project, we considered whether we needed to overturn the prepaid metering framework in the Northern Territory in order to achieve the types of community benefits with lower cost energy and access to renewables. And we really had to pick our battles, both in the regulatory space, what we were willing and able to take on with the resources we had available to us, and with the level of collaboration that was on offer in that early stage from the decision makers. So we made a decision to explore whether there were beneficial uses of the smart metering technology which could flip the prepaid meter system from being exclusively punitive to something that could be actually used to share the benefits from a community-owned renewable microgrid in the same way that we can replicate behind-the-meter benefits for rooftop solar customers.
Yes.
So it's a necessary workaround unless we were to reinvent the metering arrangements in the Northern Territory, which is a far bigger battle than we were able to have at the time. And I do think there are some benefits to the prepaid metering arrangements, which many communities prefer over the post-paid arrangements, because ultimately people are concerned about being lumped with a very large bill at the end of a cycle. And so prepaid in some cases has been beneficial for people to be able to manage, and also to share some of the costs of energy within the household between multiple families who are using the one house. There's chuck-in arrangements that are beneficial. So what we ultimately came to through this process was a decision that the smart meter technology was broad enough that it would allow us to achieve what we wanted to achieve, and the billing arrangements, whether postpaid or prepaid, almost became redundant to the debate. Really what we wanted to do was just make sure that regardless of your billing method, you had access to renewables, and you also had some level of consumer protections as well, and that's the larger battle, is to make sure that people on prepaid meters, if that's a preferred billing arrangement, that you're not being treated in a discriminatory or in a punitive fashion because of that. Every Australian energy user should be entitled to the same consumer protections from disconnection and recognition of energy hardship. And that's something that prepaid meter customers have largely been outside of the protections of in the Northern Territory and other jurisdictions that use it. So that's an ongoing fight, but I think really the question doesn't necessarily come down to is prepaid or postpaid better. It's that every energy user should have the ability to choose lower cost energy options and be supported to stay connected as essentially a basic human right and a basic right of for Australian energy consumers.
Yes, and it does seem like it's a very clever way of picking your battles. Now, talking of battles with power companies, and this is probably a question for both of you, how have you found dealing with the power company?
Yeah, look, I think in this process, it initially started out with where it was a bit of a closed shop, in the sense that we've always had a government-provided energy network and utility service in the Northern Territory, and a retailer, and up until fairly recently they were all one entity under Power and Water, and now some of those functions around generation, network operations and retailing have been split off, so there is less coordination, less ability to have a cohesive system that works for energy users in the Territory, and more of a divide between people who are protected under the regulated network system and have a Utilities Commission as a referee to go to seek changes to the system, and those that sit outside it, which are largely First Nations and remote communities. So look, we came to this process with an understanding that we weren't likely to be welcomed with open arms and invited into coming up with some of the solutions that we thought communities would need to be able to actively take part in the transition to cleaner energy. But I mean, I think one of the really great outcomes from this process has been a far more collaborative approach to working with communities and project developers like ourselves, who are bringing solutions to the table, who are happy to work within the existing frameworks, seek amendments, tweaks, workarounds that can actually deliver those benefits to remote communities, and to try and move them towards a framework where all energy consumers are entitled to the same set of rights and protections, regardless of billing arrangements or location, postcode, or any of those things. So I think we are getting closer to that, and there has been a really I think collaborative working relationship having developed out of both the Marlinger project and the Borroloola microgrid project, where we are essentially all learning as we go how to do these things and improve the systems, and essentially what's possible. I guess Original Power is thankfully in this unique position where we can put resourcing behind research and development around some of these pieces of innovation that make direct crediting of prepaid meters a possibility, for instance, and we can also test how community ownership models and various commercial models can achieve savings for both the utility and the retailer and the community, and in doing so unlock investment in upgrading remote power infrastructure and these sorts of things that otherwise wouldn't be on the table. You know, we think out of the Marlinger and Borroloola projects, we will have a blueprint for how communities can take on finance for their own renewable energy projects, work in partnership with private investors and with the Northern Territory Government to make the power system work better for all of us and achieve those savings and efficiencies at the same time.
You're listening to the Switched On podcast, and I'm talking today to some of the team from Original Power who work with First Nations communities in the Northern Territory to build clean energy projects. One of the other communities Original Power has been working with is Borroloola. They're planning to build the first Indigenous-owned, utility-scale, renewable microgrid in the Territory with a 2.1 megawatt solar array and a 3.6 megawatt per hour battery. Lauren Mellor again.
So Borroloola it's a gazetted township with a majority Indigenous population. There's 4 clan groups who call Borroloola home, the Mara, Gadanji, Garawa and Yanyuwa people. And it, over the last 200 or so years, has been a bit of a staging post for pastoral expansion, imposed extractive mining and all of the damage that's done to the region, and more recently fishing tourism and cultural tourism. But yeah, it's a community of about 1,500 people in the Gulf of Carpentaria, just sitting on the border of the Northern Territory in Queensland. And it's a community we've had as Original Power a really long-standing relationship with, which, similar to Marlinger, started with an invitation to work with the community to resist a really strong push by gas companies to open up a new gas field in what's known as the Beetaloo Basin. And the community, because of its history of having felt the impacts of extractive mining there for several decades, and the corresponding health impacts, environmental and cultural impacts from that, they were very keen to work on a solution to the energy challenges they were facing at a household and regional level, and prove to the Northern Territory government and to the rest of the world that there's a better way to produce energy that looks after the community, looks after country and looks after our climate. And so from that resistance to opening the region up to new gas mining emerged the idea that we should build a proof of concept of a community-owned energy project that could deliver all of those objectives for the community, as well as have flow-on benefits to the network operator and the retailer at the end of the day. So what we've been able to build in Borroloola there is the beginnings of a project model that, again, we think could be adopted by other communities to their real benefit, and really hopefully shows the utility in the retailer that these are projects worth partnering with to achieve the objectives that they also have in mind.
And can I ask who's funding it? How will it be funded?
So Borroloola is intended to be a project that is built on blended finance. So in part, the community's ownership stake will be achieved by a combination of bringing the lease for the land, which is held by the traditional owners, as part of the ownership stake, and it will be built on initially grant funding, which is well advanced in terms of being secured for the project. So that will be the community's buy-in and majority ownership stake in the project, and the structure is built around the idea that the community will always hold a majority ownership stake and a controlling decision-making capability over the project. And there's also then a portion of that will be open to private investment. We're talking to a range of impact investors now about fulfilling that role, and there'll be a small portion of debt that will be taken on by the community so that it can achieve a larger ownership stake. And essentially that project is now in advanced stages of negotiation with Power and Water Corporation over a long-term supply and revenue contract. So the sale of electricity from the solar and the provision of a battery in Borroloola, that contract would allow the community to have a stream of income that would be distributed back to residents in the form of direct crediting onto their meters. So the same method of benefit sharing we're trialling now in Marlinger would be scaled up to a much larger community. And that would be the responsibility of NADA, a cooperative, which is a community-owned, not-for-profit cooperative that has been set up in the same tradition as other energy cooperatives now around Australia, and it will have responsibility for distributing those benefits in the most direct way we can find, which is direct crediting onto the prepaid meters. So yeah, through that method, we think the project and the revenue contract with Power and Water will be able to respond to the needs of those investors, achieve savings in the network operations overall, and achieve a distribution of benefit back to the community that will significantly reduce the number of disconnections at a household level and provide an ongoing income stream to operate and maintain that system as well.
That's incredibly exciting. Tell me about the negotiations with Power and Water. How difficult was that?
Well, they're still ongoing, so we probably can't say too much. But look, I'll say that that so far they've been really positive, because we have been able to demonstrate how the project will achieve all of those benefits without asking the Northern Territory Government to dip into its coffers and to fund these quite substantial upgrades to the power networks. This will be an $18 million project, and really what we're hoping to do is, what we'd like to see is to maintain the role of power and water as an essential service provider to all communities in the Northern Territory. We firmly believe there's a lot of benefit to be derived from, public ownership and management of our essential services, but at the same time we weren't seeing the types of investment or urgency being put behind ensuring that Indigenous communities could benefit from renewable energy, either at a household or community level. There were a lot of structural and commercial barriers in the way. So in this way, we think community energy can be part of the public ownership mix. And most communities, to be fair, don't want to take on essential service responsibilities. Most people just want to be able to turn the lights and the fans on in their home and have affordable power that is reliable when you need it. And that's absolutely fair enough. In Borroloola, people have decided they want to take a more active role in their energy services and to actually be an owner and operator of the microgrid, which is great. But so what we're trying to achieve here is a system that operates seamlessly integrated with Power and Water's diesel power station, and they also have a small solar farm that saves some diesel for Power and Water. So ultimately we will build an asset that we hope to hand dispatch control over to Power and Water. They will use it in the most efficient way possible, and we will wind back the diesel generators in the community to the lowest possible level. And we're hoping, our estimates for this project are that we can achieve around 75-80% renewable energy penetration, and even in some cases use the system in diesel off mode for some parts of the day, which is a huge improvement on the current system that we have out there. And it's also in line with what the Northern Territory Government is proposing to do with the other 72 communities in the Northern Territory. So they currently have a plan out for consultation called the Remote Power System Strategy, which has a target of 70% renewable energy for those communities. So we're attempting to exceed that in Borroloola and demonstrate that we can do that, not wholly reliant on government or grant funding, but we can actually service that blended capital arrangement whilst maintaining reliable essential services through a public system.
That is so fantastic. It's incredibly heartening, I reckon. Can I get a final comment from you both? What do you think have been the main learnings so far from these projects that you guys have been working on? What do you think, in terms of the whole system that we're working in, needs to be changed?
Look, I think our key learnings were really going into it. We knew this wasn't going to be, there's not going to be an easy process, and it wasn't going to be met with open arms by many of the stakeholders responsible for essential service delivery in the communities. And we went into it with a mindset that we would help develop the solutions. We weren't just going in demanding change and hoping the utility or others would come up with those solutions. We knew that was unrealistic, and so we worked with the communities to understand their objectives, what success would look like in each case, and it'll be different regardless of which community energy project it is. And so really getting a clear idea of what would success look like, what are we really trying to achieve, and then that enables us to distill it down to the steps that we might need to overcome in terms of the barriers that we would face in that regulatory space. And so we had a really clear idea of which battles we needed to take and which we could leave for another day or potentially another proponent, or potentially for a process of reform with government in some other format. And so we were able to work through that strategically, and of course that is it's a process that also evolves as we're having these discussions with the decision makers. But what we've learned is bringing those solutions, bringing a spirit of collaboration and exploration, because I think there is a lot of two-way learning that's going on in this process as well. We were able to hit on solutions that worked for all parties, it met the community's objectives, and we found what those drivers were for the decision makers as well. And so we could really have a sort of win-win-win scenario where we've overall had massive improvements to the system, to energy security for the communities, and to community well-being, which was the marker of success for ourselves. So I think it's pick your battles, know what your objectives are, because you will go into a space where it's complex and you don't necessarily have access to all the information you might need about the key drivers of those other parties and decision makers. And advocate as well. Tell the story of what change will achieve in those communities. Tell the story of how jobs in the renewable sector or access to affordable energy, what will that do for the communities? What will it do for the regions? You know, there's a lot of furious agreement from governments that everyone wants to close the gap, and everyone's working towards improving these socioeconomic indicators for communities. Having access to affordable, reliable power is really one of the fundamentals. And when we can start having a conversation like that with the decision makers and ask how are they achieving that, or will they work with us to help achieve that, then we can start having a different conversation other than what's allowable under the regulatory system. And so I think in particular, with the piece of innovation that really turned a punitive system of prepaid metering on its head and turned it into a way that we could cleverly share benefit from a community system, we've found a way where suddenly it makes sense for communities to access grants or unlock their own resources and put that into a renewable energy system that improves the network overall, because there's a way that they can receive direct benefit. And that's just really, that's the fundamental piece that we needed to unlock to really see any sort of change in the remote power systems. So I think there's a great opportunity here as the Northern Territory Government thinks about how it's designing this remote power system strategy, how it's going to meet this really ambitious target of 70% renewables in the bush. We hope they'll take some of the lessons from these projects and build it into a much larger program, where we'd like to see a standardised form of benefit sharing built into that project, so that if you've got proponents coming in, everyone is required to meet that objective of lower cost energy, more reliable energy, cost efficiencies, and built into the rest of the system. So I think there's a great opportunity there with this commitment behind the RPSS already to do that and to plan better. What we don't want to see is another rollout of a program similar to Setup, which was supported by the federal government through ARENA in the early and mid-2000s, and it saw renewable energy rolled out to 25 communities in the Northern Territory, but it was generation focused, not customer focused. So the only outcome of that project was to save the Northern Territory Government and Power and Water some expenditure on diesel, but the communities that hosted those solar farms and huge battery investments completely missed out or bypassed, and they're still paying the same for power, and they're still being disconnected, if not more than they were when that program began, because obviously the cost of living continues to rise and there's been no attempt to address that in the remote areas. So I think huge opportunity there. Also at a federal level, there's never been more attention on energy and security from a federal government. We have had the First Nations Clean Energy Strategy that part of Original Power, the Clean Energy Network, has been involved in the co-design of, and that's had a really strong focus on addressing the immediate urgent needs for Indigenous communities to achieve basic levels of energy security and consumer protections from disconnection. So that's been a real about face in the focus. So we hear a lot about Australia becoming a renewable energy superpower. We don't hear a lot about basic power for Indigenous households and what's preventing people from having access to renewable energy in those areas. And they're all things that can be overcome. Largely the barriers, they're not technical, and in most cases now, because of the change in the market conditions, they're not even commercial. There is money out there for these projects, and there's even been quite significant announcements from the federal government, but what we're not seeing is a corresponding response from the state-run utilities in most cases to lift those barriers, which are policy and regulatory in nature, to allow First Nations communities to benefit from renewable energy. So that can come right down to the policies of your housing department, which might prevent the connection of rooftop solar, or it might have a regulatory barrier in place which prevents the connection of solar through a prepaid meter. All of these things we've encountered and in some cases have been able to overcome through these projects. So I think there needs to be a real spotlight put on the policy and regulatory barriers that are still existing at a state level that are preventing the capital getting into the types of projects that really will be transformative in First Nations communities. And I think with Borroloola and Marlinger, we've got two great examples of how you can work with and overcome some of those barriers, and hopefully they'll be inspiring examples that other communities now take up, and that start to see barriers lifted in that remain.
I have no doubt that other communities will be inspired. In fact, I have no doubt that there'll be other First Nation communities, but also communities all around the country who are interested in community energy. I have no doubt about that. Maddie, just one final comment from you. Main learnings that you guys, that you feel that you have learnt from the projects that you've done so far, and the main things that you think need to be changed in terms of the system, this energy system that you've got to work within?
Oh, how long do you have? So main learnings, let's start there. I think, more often than not, the utility isn't your enemy, and they're not thinking about community proponents at all. So when you do come and propose something to them, understand that they have no idea how to treat you. And so that's a blessing and a curse, but don't necessarily assume that it means that they don't want anything to do with you. It usually just means they don't know what to do with you. Mm-hmm. I think it's really possible and important, I should say. I think as well it's really important to not try and insist on the right thing, but insist on win-wins when you're talking to utilities. And I know that doesn't sound like that's correct, it doesn't feel good, but really at the end of the day, if you come with a really well-developed solution that demonstrates benefit to everyone, all the stakeholders that are required to be involved, or as many as possible, or as much benefit as possible to each of the stakeholders involved, that is going to be your best bet. Even if we think that rooftop on Marlinger is the right way technically, in fact a microgrid offers the biggest wins for the most amount of people involved. So that can be a hard pill to swallow sometimes, but I think that is very, very important. And I think as well, don't feel guilty about the fact that your solution is not as commercially competitive as your business as usual products and services out on the market. It's not supposed to be. You're brand new, you're breaking new ground. There is a premium cost and price on your project that comes from being one of the first cabs off the rank. And you just have to build that in. You have to accept that is a cost that you have to build in, that you are actually de-risking, and there's a premium price to pay for that. So don't feel guilty about that, but just trust that the more you do it, the cheaper these things will go, and the processes that you build out will help de-risk that whole process for anyone who comes after you as well. So that's probably the key learnings I find that are reassuring and motivating. Absolutely be stubborn. Find your champions within utilities. That's how you navigate bureaucracies. You find your champions, you find your friends. Be persistent, be stubborn, but also be respectful and understanding that this is brand new ground for them.
That's great advice. Well, best of luck to Original Power and the communities that you're working in. Madison Sturgess, Lauren Mellor and Chantelle Johns, thank you all so much for joining the Switched On podcast today.
Thank you for having us, especially on International Women's Day.
Yes, International Women's Day.
Yeah, no, we really appreciate it. Thanks again.
And Madison Sturgess, Chantelle Johns and Lauren Mellor are part of the clean energy team from Original Power. Hats off to these three amazing women who are all working in what is traditionally a very male-dominated space. That's it for Switched On. I hope you can join me next time when we'll take a look at a proposal from Rewiring Australia to establish a loan scheme along the lines of a HEX student loan, which would basically fund every Australian household, regardless of income, to fully electrify. I'm Anne Delaney. See you then.